Good afternoon, Kalispera. First of all, I would like to warmly thank Philippe Kenya and Gilles Rappert for this opportunity to briefly present my thesis work in Albania and to discuss it with you. As I will explain, this work has been in kind of a fridge for 4 years, and they are allowing me to take it out tonight with you. So many thanks. So outline of the presentation. The thesis was more or less divided in three parts, very classical way. There is a theoretical part that proposes a framework of interpretation for the maps and analyses that were produced. That is geohistory. I will say a few words about that. There is a methodological part that describes the process of acquisition, localization, and harmonization of data, and also which criticizes the condition of validity of this data. This part also proposes, as Gilles said, different kinds of regionalization and typology of space to which to relate the data in such a way as to support the discourse on the spatial and territorial evolution of Albania. And finally, there is a part which Gilles called the historical narrative, kind of an overview of the modern history of Albania through the description of a series of spatial systems that characterize the different periods of modern history, and relying, of course, in particular on our corpus of data and its confrontation with the literature on Albanian history. This part, which is the main part of the thesis, is of course difficult to summarize. I will therefore limit myself today to giving one or two examples that seems to me to illustrate the use of the data. And as the purpose of this meeting is to discuss the interest of the work carried out for research, I think that, and this in the perspective of different disciplines you are working on, I think the most useful thing is to say a few words here about the corpus of data and the methods, so that you can get your own idea on the interest that it could or it could not represent for your own work. So I will essentially speak about methodology, and then I give you a small introduction of the context of the work, because it's kind of a special context. On one side, I had the opportunity to discover Albania since 2003 through an occasional collaboration with the Albanian Statistical Office, INSTAT, on question of cartography methods, later on post-census analysis on the question of urbanization. So this is the first picture on the left here, the first mission there at INSTAT. And on the other side, as I got interested by the story of this country, the history of this country, in 2007, I met for the first time Archil Berjoli, who was a doctor and professor of geography, who was then, I would say, in early retirement. I think he was still teaching in Elbasan, but in the end of his career. He had published a demographic atlas that included a certain amount of historical data. It's the reason why I contacted him. Having often heard that Albania was poor in historical statistical information, and that the available information was not comparable over time because of the numerous territorial administrative reforms that occurred in Albania, I asked him the question, because he was a specialist of this. And then at this moment, so Akile is here. At this moment, he showed me handwritten notebooks in which he had recorded in the National Archives the population of each village of Albania as recorded during the 7 censuses carried out during the communist period. So it was kind of a treasure when I saw these things. I said, we should do something with this. So the idea of a collaboration for the digitalization and valorization of this corpus then emerged at that moment, in which Martin Schuler, which is at the center of the picture there, who at that time was my boss, Eiffel, his polytechnical school. He was also very interested in this historical data because he did the same kind of work in Switzerland. So he also got involved, and we decided to collaborate. The idea was to digitalize, but also to map this information and to try to relate it to more recent or older data to try to see to what extent this could provide new elements in the knowledge of the demographic evolution and also the urbanization of Albania. So that was the project. But as for a lot of projects, it did not move forward for a long time. And I really began to work on it in 2016. At that moment, I had the opportunity to start a thesis. In addition to my work in the administration, I had left the academic context, but I came back to work on this historical data. And then I defended the thesis 4 years ago in 2020. And after that, I changed my professional activity and I no longer had the opportunity to work on this data. So I'm grateful, I say to Hudson once again, to bring it back today. So I just say a few words about the theoretical framework in order to explain the perspective in which we did handle the collective data and also the kind of data we were interested in. We can say that our framework can be called geohistory, which can be defined as a special study of historical processes, or perhaps in a simple way, we can say that often it consists in writing history as a succession of geographies or a succession of spatial systems, and the transition between the systems, the illustration you have here. And also how this succession of spatial systems we try to understand and describe drive to present day situation. So geography usually differentiate space, environment, and territory. So space is about relative position and distance between social facts, as territory is about how a social group controls a certain portion of space. In a diachronic perspective, we can say that space rather refers to a logic of fluidity, social transformation, commerce, diffusion of information, that kind of things, while territory rather refers to slower temporalities and work as a support for social reproduction. And then we can say that geohistory describes kind of the dialectic of these two different temporalities. There is a French geographer or historian, Christian Grattalou, who uses the term of historité or histority. I don't know if I think it's not used in English, but histority we can say, which refers to a certain intensity of social change. And this histority has often something to do with specific geographical situations. For example, a situation where you have a combination of density and a good position of networks and these kind of things. So in this context of this approach, the information that interests us concerns, of course, the question of urbanization, but also all data about mobilities and migrations, and also territorialities, accessibilities. The evolution of the cost of mobility is a very important parameter to explain the phenomena, and also the networks and the evolution and so on. So that you can understand the kind of information we were interested to try to gather and to analyze our state of mind while working on this data. So I hope you can see a little bit. It's a bit small, like a lot of illustration theses are very compact. These are the data. The graph illustrates the relationship between the corpus of data, the successive period of modern political history in Albania, and the major political and spatial systems to which they relate. So these are the upper lines. It's not important if you can't read, it's just to see the important information, which are the years written in a red black and blue, excuse me, I apologize for my English, black and blue, which corresponds to the census or countings of population or the extract of register I could obtain. And the vertical lines significate that for this year, I could obtain local data out of these countings. And another interesting information is the small gray squares that are at the top. That are the main territorial reforms in Albania, which means the published statistical data are usually published in accordance with the official regions, territories, and when you change it, it means the statistical information is not more comparable over time. So it was one of the interests of going down to these settlements, basic units, village, cities, so that to try to compare data of population time. So to describe a little bit the sources, they are the statistical sources and also the spatial information, because we wanted to localize precisely, the most precise as possible, this information. So I won't talk about the spatial information, but just mention that I collected all kind of historical topographical maps to find, for example, the village historical villages that disappeared since this time. So these are the Austrian, Italian, and Albanian topographical map. I put all these things in big GIS system. Also the list of toponyms, especially the list built by Franz Zeiner, who was responsible of the Austrian census at the beginning of the 20th century. Who built a very impressive and precise list of toponyms. There are other lists of toponyms and also other geographical information like the cadastral zones that exist not all over Albania, but in most places. But then for the sources, I have a few slides about it. So the first time that local data, so at village and cities scale, were systematically collected or more or less systematically collected is during the Second Balkan War and the subsequent First World War. And in this context, kind of chaotic context of occupations, population counts could be carried out by the Greeks in the south in 1913. These are the dots you can see on the map. Then by the French army in the east, and then by the Austrian in the center and the northern part of Albania in the 1918. What you see here are the villages counted by the Greek in what they called at the time Northern Epirus. In yellow are the villages counted by the Greek, and in orange, the villages that were also counted by the French 5 years later. And then I go on with the village counted by the French, so under by the French Army of the East, under the name of this territory they administrated during, I think, 4 years under the name of Republic of Korcha. And they made accountings, which was published after the war by Jacques Bourcard, French geographer. So these are the villages counted by the French. And then you have the most important data are corresponding to the Austrian census, which was a real census in the modern sense of the term. The other were rather countings of population, but this was made by a professional with a field work before the census, this list of toponym. So it's a very interesting source of information. And then last, so these are the data we have. And then the green dots here are the villages or cities that appear years later, the communist or modern countings, because they could not be counted during the war because of the front zones, or because they correspond to a new locality that appears later, like agricultural cooperative or new towns, etc. So this gives a synthetic view of all these villages and cities we could put in the database. Voilà. Then I just say a few words more about the Austrian census, because what is fascinating about this census, that's the individual questionnaires that you can see here, German, that should have been destroyed, were in fact returned to the military archives in Vienna after the retreat. But most part of them, some were destroyed, did, but most part was put in the archives in Vienna. And almost 1 century later, I think about around the year 2000, a team of historians and demographers in Austria, Karl Kaser, Siegfried Huber, and others, they took these questionnaires out of the archives and they got the funding to capture a large sample of individual data, which is very rare, that kind of data at this time. And we therefore have a rare and precious source, which allows us in particular, that you can see on the small maps, you don't really see, but these are maps where we can reconstruct in detail certain mobilities. Here, this is the place of birth of people residing in 4 cities of northern Albania at that time. So it's a precise registration at what moment of this migration for certain localities. Then the interwar period is very poor in statistical data. The man that you can see on this painting is Teki Selenika, who was a senior civil servant trained in the Ottoman context. And he is the main actor of the collection and publication of statistical data at this period, which is the period of the establishment of the monarchy of King Zog, and which is also the period the Albanian state begin to consolidate and to establish a kind of a modern administration. The book you see here, it published in 1927. Among other things, there is inside a list of the population of each village and their religious affiliation, which allow to make the map you see on the left, which give a very precise picture of this religious affiliation at that moment. Then these are these booklets of Archie Laboratory. So all the data for different communist censuses for total population and female population. What to say? What is understand to perhaps to understand? It's important to understand is apart for this document, as far as I know, the only specialized statistical data you can find in scientific or in statistical books are at this kind of level, which are the district. So it's this information at local level is really rich and, as I already said, comparable over time. And then for the modern period, you have 3 modern censuses have been carried out in 2001, 11, and last year in 2023. And I think the first result was published just a few months ago in June, July. And this last census I did not analyze, of course, but it shows increasing depopulation of Albania. The average annual growth rate was minus 0.3 between 1989 and 2001, the first decade after communism. Then it was minus 0.9, and last decade it seems to be minus 1.3. So increasing the population of the country. As you see on this example of maps, the modern censuses technically allow to drive analysis at any kind of spatial level because the information is specialized at the level of each household address. But the difficulty is rather to obtain the data. They exist, but it's not always easy to get it. It was possible for census 2001, but not for census 2011 at the level of villages. And with this data, one thing we could do is to build migration matrices you see on the left, which we used a lot in the thesis to try to understand these migrations here without and with migration. Okay, I go on with a few slides about the question of localization, harmonization, and cartography of historical data. It was a huge and partly very tedious task, I must say. I present it very quickly. So I began by creating this historical GIS system with cartographic, toponymic, and cadastral information that I've been able to collect over the years. Here you can see an extract of the cartography made by the Italians in the 30s or 40s, and that shows villages in the big coastal plain Musicce, the big plain near Fier. And you see here the 4 villages that appears on the map. And if you see, you look at the the Albanian map that was made 30 or 40 years later, it has changed a lot. You have this big transformation of the agricultural landscape. You have the draining of large marshes, the reclamation of land, the concentration of the habitat. And what happened is 3 of the 4 villages that existed before disappeared, and they were replaced by this large agricultural settlements. And if we try to put on the map the information you can find in different sources, you have also a lot of problems because the village name that you see here, these are the different names of the village we can find in different sources. They may, of course, depending on the region of Albania, appear different languages, but even in Albanian, the spelling is very unstable. You have sometimes a lot of occurrences of the same name of village across Albania, up to 20 times the same name. And another problem is the confusion between village and hamlets, which means that sometimes small settlements are counted together with the village, sometimes they are counted on their own, and sometimes they are even counted with another village. And we have some information on the maps to understand these things, but then you have to make hypotheses on the base of the total of the population, how it has been done. And in the table, you will see these hypotheses appear. And then I try to draw some borders in order to be able to make maps, this data. And I essentially draw the border according to the cadastral zones when they were available. And then it doesn't have the potential to be precise, just the best I could do with the data I had. And here you see today's borders, and then in red in the middle, I draw border roughly to be able to make maps also on village that disappeared when necessary. And then just to say that 2 years ago, I could handle some data of census 2011, and I was allowed by Instat to make a test. In the census, you have information of belonging to the village based on self-declaration of the people. So these are the color on these dots. In the center, you see Berat. All the dots are in blue because all the people say we are in Berat. And you see it for each village. And the borders are the one I had told before, and the overlapping, of course, it's very satisfying. I don't know. I think it's 90% the same, and 8 to 9% to be quite correct. The job is not done, but it would be possible to have more precise limit of these villages. Then this is how this final table look like. So these are the data, and they are about 1,500 nodes. So I think there are 3,300 lines. So the principle is if a village appears only once, it is in the table. But for one line out of 2, there is a node. So it's just to say that all the things I said before, I try to document the hypotheses and why it is like this in the table. And if I zoom a little bit, I don't know, is it in English bracket or the accolade brackets, you see the hypothesis of how villages were counted. For example, Berat, there is a neighborhood of Berat, Buznove, that was considered by the Austrians as being part of Berat, but then in 1926, they counted it separately. Then it disappeared out of the table for 1 century, and I think in 1989 or 2001, it reappeared. So I tried to put this bracket to say, okay, this is probably the way that was counted. Then at the end, all this got into this, go into this GIS system in order to make this map. This is the indicator I mapped it in a very systematical way is the inter-census growth rate, annual growth rate, evolution of population. In red, the growth include the loss of population. Okay, I finish with this part. I say a few words about this classification typologies, which was also an important part. I will start with an anecdote. Is there an English term for anecdote? Small story. When we began to discuss with Instat possible analysis to be carried out on the basis of the 2011 census, and we proposed to work specifically in urban agglomerations. A collaborator of Instat pointed out that, according to the preliminary result, there was a tendency for urban dwellers to return to live in the countryside. We suggested that this could depend on what is considered urban or not urban, but the statistician replied that there is no need to argue. Communes are rural, municipalities are urban. But in fact, this is the official definition at the time for urban, but it was inherited in most part from the communist era, and it did not take into account phenomena that affected Albania after 91. In particular, the dramatic decline of the small peripheral industrial and or mining units that were considered as cities even when they were very small units. And also the intense suburbanization that marked in particular the metropolitan area of Tirana Durrës. And this suburbanization mainly took part in rural communes. So it means that with this state of mind, we would consider what is considered a migration from the city to the countryside also includes people leaving these very small settlements in the far periphery of Albania to move to the suburbs of the metropolitan zones, which is obviously an upward migratory trajectory. It's not going from the city to the country. Somewhere it's the opposite. So what I want to say is our data on population that are kind of rudimentary, they are very simple data, but they can take on meaning from the moment we relate them to spaces and territories that themselves have a meaning. So the definition of these territories and spaces constitutes an important step before any description or any attempt of explanation of the patterns of the data. So I described briefly different typologies and regionalization. We made some things about environment that allows us to show the steps of this historical move of population from the mountains to the plain. On the right, you have an old map of the agricultural economy types. We can also show how the people move from land where was practiced kind of survival farming to improved farmland, allowing surpluses in the plain. So we try to show this kind of move on the base of this kind of classification. We also try to make some maps of the cultural area, let's say. For example, the classification of villages you see in the center according to the religious affiliation make it possible to test hypotheses of differential population evolution in comparable historical and geographical context. In some villages at one moment that are in the same kind of small village in a remote area, we see an important difference between the, let's say, Muslim and Orthodox villages in the south. Is there an explanation? We just see the data and then we try to find something in literature that would, together with the data, begin to show something. On the right, you have the attempt of regionalization based on what some author called ethnographic regions. I don't know if we can call it like this. There are specialists here, but at least it seems to me that it corresponds to some regional identities that are still present among Albanians. And for me, it was kind of a way of constituting an intermediate level, regional level, that can be used over time, unlike administrative division that are changing. So I generally also produce the data for these different kind of cultural areas. On the right, you see the tribal territories, as they were called by Franz Zeiner, census, Austrian census. I did not really use it, but it's to show that once we have localized this population of village precisely, we can compare with any kind of map still, like this one. And then last but not least, this socioeconomic typologies of territory. This is the attempt we made for the communist period. So we did the classification of cities based on the size of the city, and for the new towns, on the economic orientation, more or less industrial cities versus more administrative cities. And for villages, the classification is based on the size and on the accessibility. It's the map in the middle is kind of a map of accessibility during communist time. In red, the places from when it's easy to reach cities, and the gray and dark places are the remote area. And then you have this map on the right, which is the result, the typology of localities. And we had, I didn't have to do it for the basis because we did it before with Instat. This same kind of classification on the basis of census 2001 and 2011. It's also based on the size and the status of cities, but it includes a definition of agglomeration because of this suburbanization. Concern also communes, rural communes. So the definition of suburban communes based on the built-up density and by its classical way of built-up density and continuity, and also when they exist, the intensity of commuters flows. So this is for 2011, and we make an update. This was for 2001, and 2011 we made an update. It's essentially the same. The difference we considered the urban agglomeration of Tirana is different from the other one because of this huge centralization that can be observed, and we call it from this low metropolitan area. It's purple colors. And in the end, Gilles said before, but there is an attempt to reconstruct all these successive administrative divisions. This map shows the difference from one situation to the next one. On the left, you have in orange, these are the approximative, because I didn't have very precise map. Perhaps in the archive, you can find relation between some region with the Gaza or vilayets they belong, but roughly it's what I could do. And yeah, I try to do it for the successive state of the territory. At the end on the right, you have this the last mutation that was in 2015, where they had before 373 common municipalities, and they put it together to have 61 municipalities, which is not a good operation for cartographers because it's more difficult to find a bit segregated data. And then this is the typical result of all this kind of these maps of intercensal evolution of population. So on the right is a symbol map. Bivariate means the side of the symbol represents the size of the population, and the color is the evolution in annual growth rate. On this kind of map, you can see what happens in the city, but you don't really see what happens in less dense areas. So I often put a map on the right, which is a surface map, but plays the same information. And then down, you can see this figure that I try to calculate systemic based on this classification methodology I showed before. And for example, here, this is the period before the Second World War. And you see, no, you don't see, but I tell you, there are the values for the affiliation, the religion in the village, the Muslim villages, Orthodox and Catholic villages. And we can see that the annual growth rate is of 1.8% for the Muslim villages, 0.9 for the Catholic villages, and no growth in the Orthodox villages. So this is an information that should be compared with the localization and other things, but it's interesting and requires further research queries. Then, I don't know, time is going. I don't know if you give me 10 more minutes, I show the 9 maps of the different, otherwise we can, yeah. Okay, so I go on, is the one of the results of the work. So I show you briefly this series of maps. Some commentaries. So this is the first feasible map of the local evolution of population. So it's always the same colors, red for the growth, blue for the loss of population. And this map looks at a highly fragmented mosaic, which is explained by the context. It's based on the data collected during the war. Very local, even history marked by conflicts, exile, etc., violences. And also in this kind of chaotic context, of course, there were probably a lot of problems with the collect of data. So it shouldn't be over-interpreted, but there is one fact that we can see on this map, which is globally significant, is the only moment of modern Albanian history when the general dynamic of the population migration from the mountain and the plain to the plain, which is described by, for example, by historian and anthropologist Mark Tirta, as having already begun under Tanzimat. But at this period, we can see here that this tendency, this movement is stabilized or even reversed. The plains stagnate in terms of population or even get depopulated, and the hills and mountains tend to gain population, general analysis. Then the second one is about runs from the Selenica survey of 1926 to the first communist survey census in 45. And this map appears very structured. The main feature is what we could call coastalization, which is the moment of Albanian history where is the strongest, is this move of the people from the mountain to the coastal plains. And especially in the central region, the Muzeche Plain and the city, we observe a very important urbanization, and especially in Durrës and Tirana. Durrës increased from 5,000 to 18,000, and Tirana from 12,000 to 16,000 this period. And at that time, Tirana became really this undisputed, I would say, center of Albania. It was not the case before. Tirana was a kind of a secondary city. Next period is the first data, the communist era. From the point of view of spatial dynamics, it's continuation of the previous period, except that a new constraint on emigration, because the country began to be closed, and the position of the southern elites, the communist elites were coming especially from the southern part of the country, and they tend to migrate a lot before this period, and then they could not emigrate. So this migration tends to shift to the Muzeche Plain, the city of the Muzeche, and especially to Tirana, at the beginning of the very big migration of the southern people to Tirana. This is also what is sometimes called the phase of primitive socialist accumulation, which means the strong emphasis on heavy industry with, at the time, the support of the Soviets. This moment also marked the beginning of the demographic transition. So the birth rate began to increase, the mortality began to decrease, and the general population increased really significantly. The urban growth exceeds 5% a year, mainly in, you can see these big dark dots, which are Tirana, Elbasan, Vlorë, Fir, and also it's a bit smaller, but Kuchove, which was at the time called Ciutat Stalin. So these big cities, you have very important growth. And the next period, even more, which are the second half of the 50s, is the peak of both demographic growth, plus 3.3% each year, and also the peak of Albanian urbanization. Tirana and all the large cities gain 5 to 6% a year, which is really important. All these big cities were in the situation, but Shkodër and in the north, the lighter point, you see in the north, and Gjirokastër that were kind of marginalized at this moment. Then the next period, the situation changed radically. I can let you get the impression of this. So the next 3 decades were marked by the application of strict policies of internal migration. And from the 60s onward, there was a general downward trend in growth levels. So less growth of population, and surtout and mainly was a period of homogenization of this rate growth level. But nevertheless, this was the decade of the greatest rural growth in Albanian history, which was at the time really important. And also the large cities were largely deprived of this migratory inflows. There were a lot of new towns. These are the medium-sized dots, very dark map. These are the new towns who experience at that time significantly greater dynamic than the rest of the localities. And this from the 60s to the 80s. These new town were often quite small settlements linked to mining or industry, and also some of them were relays of power, relays of administration in some remote area, like in the northeast, so Bayramturi. And also some agri-town kind of big settlements resulting from the concentration of agricultural activity. So the next decade is a continuation, is the peak of this form of territorial equalization and selective urban growth. So selective means these small and new towns are still growing, but not the big cities. The strongest urban growth was linked to industrial and railway development. You see some big dark points that are Elbasan, the center. At that time, they built a big petrochemical complex. And it's also the time, it's always, it's connected with the development of railways. Railways always reach the point where it's developed a big combinat or industry. So at this moment, it was, I think, the fourth 5-year plan. It was especially in Elbasan and in Fir, where was built the petrochemical complex. And the last decade, always this kind of homogeneous growth. It was a period of the context of very depreciated economy. But the state continued to regulate migration to a large extent. And they continued to make what is sometimes called rural retention. It means because of this rule affecting the internal migration, it was really difficult to live even a remote poor village in the mountain. You had no other option than staying there. And it became to be what certain person call a demographic bomb, because this rural population doubled in 20 or 30 years. And the collectivization in this part was a relative failure. It came late in the Northern Mountains, and it was a relative failure. So it means this region in the 80s, all Albania, but especially this region, they experimented a very deep scarcity. And then, you probably know it, this is the gap between the end of the communist period and the first period democratic Albania. So the transition is marked by very well, a lot of people study this period, but it's marked by a collapse of the birth rate, the dramatic immigration, and massive rural depopulation, especially in the mountainous area, all these dark blue villages. The small white dots are villages that during this period, they lost 75% of the population. So you can say they disappeared on the map. And there are some more that disappeared in the decades, following decade. And this is also the period. Yes, the population of the plain is quite stable, so the mountains are losing population. And there is one place that we begin to call metropolitan because of this huge migration and centralization is the Tirana Durrës area. That's where we can observe at that time a very large chaotic development of self-constructed or informal suburbs, as they are called. That were made up out of migration from the northeast region of Skopje space. So this is the first decade, and the second, unfortunately, we don't have data at village level, but it's the continuation of the trend, except that apart from the metropolitan region, the center, the urban as a whole is now shrinking. The first decade, it was the cities in the place, they were gaining a little bit, but in the second decade, they began to lose population. And especially the former new towns have been rapidly emptied of their inhabitants in the 90s, and they were first replaced by rural neighbors in the 90s. But then, in the context of the collapse of the entire decentralized industrial infrastructure after 91, these localities offered no prospect for these newcomers. The people living there in 90, they left. Some people from Dora, they went there, but there were not a lot of opportunities. So this big population also began to left this small town. So they function as kind of temporary relays in the trajectory of the family. And this trajectory then go on to the more central, more urban places or the growth. The metropolitan suburbs continue. You see here the very dark places in the center are suburbs like Kamus, Paskucha, village around Tirana. But the growth is going on there, but no longer as the result of migration from the mountain or the country part, but rather as the result of a centrifugal movements from the center to these places. And these are not, at that time, we did not more see this kind of informal suburb, but rather large and high density neighborhoods. And I could not analyze data of the last census, but just take a look at it. I have the feeling that this urbanization process in the metropolitan area is also shrinking now. Because, for example, the municipality of Kamus, which is where we put together, I think, Kamus, Paskucha, or some other, who historically was the place of this urbanization immigration. Even this suburb is now losing population. But I don't know precisely. And on the website, you can find only data at the 61 municipality levels, which is not good. But it's what the feeling you can have. So that's it. I finished. I have perhaps just as kind of probably conclusion, I want to say that this work has ideographic dimension, I mean, um, I, I had a concern for very local questions because of the using of disaggregated data. It's kind of unusual at Wikipedia to work at this level, and it contributes to make the work very difficult to summarize because it's kind of a collection of local information trying to interpret literature. So it's difficult to summarize, but I hope that it also constitutes a kind of richness that was necessarily not fully explored in the thesis, but that perhaps it offers some perspectives that any of the readers, people reading this document, that they can bring some new perspectives and light, and perhaps for the discussion. It's, thank you again.